and welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? I'm Jack.
And I'm
And today, I actually don't know what you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about communism. So fun, communism and the Red Scare.
My favorite.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before I talk about today's topic, I wanted to remind all of our new listeners to subscribe to our show and to leave a review wherever you're listening to us from, and also to follow us on our social media at HDWNKT.
Yeah, NKT.
NKT, that's a mouthful. And then social media, you guys can answer our polls, and you also get the latest updates about our new episodes, which is super cool. And some more exciting news, you can now check out our Patreon to become a supporter of the show, and you can see how you can become a history hero and get a fun shout out in one of our future episodes. So definitely check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So enough of
enough of our propaganda to get you to support us.
Please, you must. Today I'm talking about the Red Scare and McCarthyism. So before I go on ahead, Jack, what do you know about the Red Scare?
Okay. I've never heard of McCarthyism, that second thing that you just said, but the Red Scare was during the, is it like World War II era? Yeah, it is, right? It's okay. So World War II. Yeah, I think we're just like very scared of the rise of communism, to the point where I believe people were like reporting their neighbors if they thought you were a communist. But yeah, I only know because of the space race. Remember, like, or was it the space race? With the space race, when they like formed, they like joined alliances with the Soviet Union because like Nazi Germany was worse than communism at the time. So
yeah, no, yeah, it's like kind of in the same time period. It's during the Cold War, but yeah. So I remember learning about the Red Scare in high school. I just remember like Senator McCarthy, who we'll talk about later, and yeah, pretty much the same thing. Just like, oh, communism is bad and it's gonna tear down our country. But after doing research, I did not realize the extent that it had in our government and like the laws we were passing, and it's so scary. Also, like, I did not realize there are actually two Red Scares. So this was news to me. So the first Red Scare, it actually began during World War One. So in 1917, there is the outbreak of the Russian Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And Bolsheviks are basically, it's like another word for communism, kind of. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks destroy the Romanov dynasty that had been ruling Russia up until then. So I'm not gonna.
is it the monarchy with like Princess Anastasia that goes missing?
Yeah, like the movie.
Okay.
I loved that movie when I was little, and it's such like the real story is super super dark. But yeah, I'm not gonna much.
Scary.
I know.
It's like nighttime and we're in closets. Like, I don't want to not be able to sleep.
Yeah, everyone should check out our YouTube channel, see us filming in our parents' closet. Yeah, so yeah, the Romanov dynasty had been ruling forever, and the US was actually supporting the dynasty and Tsar Nicholas. And after World War One, they actually sent troops to Russia, hoping that they could help defeat the Red Communist rebel forces. But the Bolsheviks won, and they murder the entire Romanov family, and they slowly secure control all over Russia. And so this is pretty much the beginning of the rise of the Communist Party. But it's not like this was the first time anyone had heard of communism. So Karl Marx's ideology had been well known since 1848. He was kind of the father of communism. But this revolution in particular was so, I guess, triggering because up until now, it had just been a theory. And before this, no country in the world had had a successful communist revolution. And so capitalist countries all around the world were like, uh-oh, this is not good. And there's widespread international fear of communism and anarchy in general. So in the US, veterans are returning home from World War I, and workers were demanding increases in order to keep up with increasing inflation in the US. And so in the short period following World War I, there are actually over 3,300 labor strikes in the US. And in 1919, a small group of radicals formed the Communist Labor Party. And the press basically sensationalized all of these labor strikes as being caused by immigrants who wanted to destroy the American way of life. And everyone, including both progressive and conservative Americans, were super scared of a communist revolution in the US. And they pretty much decided that the labor activism was a threat to national security and it had to be stopped as soon as possible. And so I just want to do a quick throwback to episode 5, Is It Free Speech or Espionage? We talked about the Sedition Act of 1918. Do you remember? Like, you don't have to quote it, but you just, like, we talked about, yeah.
Wasn't it that, like, in wartime, you cannot, your freedom of speech is, like, limited in times of war?
Yeah, kind of. Like, this act, it targets people who criticize the government. So, yeah, it limits their free speech. And it monitored radicals and labor unions with the threat of deportation. So yeah, you were spot on. We go way more into detail in episode 5. So
I pay attention. I rewatched our episodes. Okay, I have a question too before you go on. So you said anarchy and communism are like both, they're scared of both. They're separate scares though? Because like is communism anarchy, or they're not the same?
No, not at all. They're like not even similar, but they're just scared of a revolution that will overthrow their government and like the system, the American system and capitalism. And so they kind of put the two together because like communism has nothing to do with anarchy, but they're just like, oh, in order to become a communist country, we'd have to overthrow our current way of government. And so yeah, that's kind of why they're like, okay, anarchy in general, like that anarchy just means no government at all, and like everyone barters and like does whatever they want. um, so yeah, they were just scared of an overthrow of the government, if that makes sense. And they kind of their fear isn't unwarranted, because in 1919, the U.S. is shook by a series of bombings carried out by anarchists that targeted the homes of law enforcement and government officials in Boston, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New York City. And so Americans are absolutely terrified because their worst fears seem to be coming true, like right in front of their own eyes. And U.S. Attorney General Alexander U.S. Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer would carry out what would later be known as the Palmer Raids. And these were a series of violent law enforcement raids that targeted leftist radicals and anarchists in 1919 and 1920. And this would later be known as the Red Summer. Okay, so through Palmer's support, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, also known as the FBI, is created under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover. So it's basically created to find communists within the federal government. So in January 1920, FBI agents break into the homes of suspected anarchists without any search warrants, and then they arrest labor leaders. They end up holding about 5,000 citizens without respecting their right to legal counsel. And eventually, most of these people are released, but 249 Russian immigrants are deported without just cause. So this is like completely awful and is obviously a blatant violation of civil liberties. But Palmer, he believed that American civil liberties were less important than protecting national security. So it's just like horrifying to see, I don't know, just like the tenets of our legal system is completely thrown out the window. And yeah, and they're targeting immigrants too. So I'm sure they had a lot less power, in the
so there's always a loophole. It's like life and liberty, all men are created equal, but like, you know what I mean? There's always something.
Yeah, exactly. So that was really upsetting to hear about, and it like continues. Like it just gets worse. So basically, this is the first Red Scare, right? So eventually it dies down because then we enter World War II and we're focused on Nazi Germany. But then World War II ends, and then the fear of communism is reignited and becomes much more intense because after World War II, the US and Soviet Union become enemies in the Cold War. So that's, yeah, we talked about the Cold War a little bit in our space race episode. A lot more lighthearted than what we're about to do.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That was such a fun episode. Go ahead. Sorry.
Everyone should check it out. Yeah, 10 out of 10. Great job, Jack. But yeah, so the whole country is scared of Americans working as Soviet spies, and this poses a threat to national security. So you might be thinking like, okay, everyone, like, just chill. That's a bit dramatic that there are like Soviet spies in our government. But there's actually quite a long history of the Soviet Union carrying out espionage activities inside the US through the help of US citizens, especially during World War II. There are also several huge events around the world at this time that really like ignite this fear and make the threat of a communist revolution seem more likely. And so in August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests its first nuclear bomb, and the US is like, oh no. Try not to swear, but like insert expletive, but yeah. So also in 1949, communist forces led by Mao Zedong take control over China. And then through 1950 to 1953, US troops are fighting the communist supported forces of North Korea in the Korean War. And so, yeah, we're fighting communists all over the world, and we're just like, we're seeing it spread, and we're like, oh my gosh, it's only a matter of time before it takes over the US. So very quickly we start to see, I guess, our federal government respond to this, right? So in March 21st, 1947, President Harry Truman issues Executive Order 9835, also known as the Loyalty Order. This mandates that all federal employees must be analyzed to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the government. Which, like, just the wording itself, like, loyal to the government, that's so ominous. And it's like a huge deal for a country that prides itself with the values of personal liberty and freedom of political organization. Like, I don't know, this is just crazy that this got passed.
Yeah, it feels a bit 1984, which I think is such a 1984. I like have issues with that book, but yeah, that line just feels very like it's out of a dystopian novel.
Yeah, so this is what President Truman passes. Also in the FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, they begin compiling extensive files on suspected spies through the use of wiretaps and surveillance, and they also infiltrate leftist groups. And these files and evidence are later used in the court. And so one of these was the high-profile conviction of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for espionage. They were basically accused of overseeing a spy network that stole American atomic bomb secrets and handed them over to the Soviet Union. And they were found guilty and were executed 2 years later, making them the only alleged spies executed during the Red Scare. And Hoover was super anti-communist, and he was also super quick to label any kind of protest as communist, including major civil rights demonstrations at the time. So he had actually labeled Martin Luther King Jr. as a communist. So we see our presidents passing laws. We see our judicial system also freaking out, and then the FBI is freaking out. And then if we look at the House of Representatives and Congress, we see the creation of the House Un-American Activities Committee, also known as HUAC. It was actually formed in 1938, but it really reached its heights in the 1950s. So federal employees, especially those in the State Department and intelligence agencies, were analyzed to determine whether or not they were loyal to the government. And again, this isn't even a partisan issue. Politicians on both sides tried to make sure no one thought they were anti-communist, and no one wanted to criticize these tactics used to punish suspected communists because they were scared of the backlash they would receive.
Yeah. Then you look like you're a communist. It's like, what's the big deal if you're not a communist? Why? Then we should have this policy. Yeah.
People are so quick to point fingers, so quick to convict, and it's just like a really terrifying time, you know?
Yeah, it's like that. What is it? Like the witch like
Yeah,
hunt things that were going on.
yeah, the Salem witch trials. Yeah, literally, it's just like pointing, oh, you're a communist. Like,
Yeah. I have a question with so what are you going to explain kind of what is deemed as loyal versus not loyal to the government?
I mean, that's the thing is like it's super vague, and so
Oh.
as an umbrella, like, oh, if you're seen as more to the left, more communist in some way, like, okay, you're not loyal to the government. But people use this tactic. Actually, the tactic itself is called red baiting. When you just point fingers at someone, you're like, you're a communist, like, you're out of here. But like politicians would just use it against their political enemies. And so, like, if you didn't get along with someone, you'd be like, okay, well, he's a communist. Like the NAACP was labeled as a communist
Of
organization.
course they were. I could go on and on and on. But yeah, no, I'm not surprised that they labeled the NAACP as communist.
So like there doesn't even have to be evidence. Like you could just say like, oh, I just know like they're a communist, and people, yeah, there's just little evidence is needed in order to convict someone. So it really is just like the Salem witch trials. But yeah, so as a result, obviously leftist political group membership falls and opposing voices fall silent because everyone's horrified. And also, this is crazy. 28 states actually banned the public use or the public display of red flags in their state, which is like just so extreme. And yeah, and so the height of the Red Scare, I mean, I can't really talk about the Red Scare without talking about Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin and McCarthyism. So he's pretty much synonymous with the Red Scare. He spent 5 years trying to expose communists in the government, and his career as an anti communist basically begins in February 1950 when he gives a speech where he declares that he has a list of 205 known members of the Communist Party who were, quote, working and shaping policy, unquote, in the State Department. And the next month, the Senate launched an investigation, but they don't find any proof of any subversive activity. And actually, at the beginning, many of his colleagues, both Democratic and Republican, including President Dwight D. Eisenhower, they don't like him or the tactics he's using. But McCarthy continues his red baiting techniques. And in 1953, at the beginning of his second term as senator, he's put in charge of the Committee on Government Operations. And this position allows him to launch even more investigations of the alleged communist infiltration of the government. So he has even more power. And over the course of several hearings, McCarthy interrogated these witnesses extremely aggressively, and it can be considered as a direct violation of their civil rights. And although there's little to no evidence of espionage, more than 2,000 government employees lost their jobs as a result of his investigations, which is so much, like 2,000 people over the course of a few years. Isn't it insane? That,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like, okay, the thing is, when you're saying this, I'm gonna go back to 1984. So you know, in that, if you've read 1984, for the viewers who have not read 1984, it's a big, um, not a big novel, but it's a really really important novel that I think they make most high schoolers read, and it basically is supposed to talk about a dystopian society that would result with the rise of, is it communism? It's like government regime that's like,
like
eh,
totalitarian government.
yeah, totalitarian, and they're always inspecting you. But the last scene in it, spoiler, if you wanted to read it, sorry, here it goes. Um, one of the last scenes is they basically like torture the main character with his greatest fear to get him to admit to crimes that he didn't necessarily commit, but also like betray like his loved ones. And they like play on like your greatest fears, and that just feels like this book that is like totalitarian and like anti-communism, anti-surveillance, and then the tactics that were being used by McCarthy, where you literally interrogate to I don't know what extent till you get them to admit to things that maybe they didn't even do. I like it's
Well, yeah, no, you're completely right. Like the the legal system was not just at all. Like there's no evidence, and people like aren't being defended properly and no one's listening. Like literally as soon as you hear the word communism, like you're just painted as evil and as a traitor to the country. And so no one takes it seriously. But again, like I mean, yeah, McCarthy had like a huge like a lot of people supported him. I guess in politics people just were scared to get on his bad side because they'd be his next victim. But the American people like were really scared of a revolution in their country, and then they thought their way of life was going to be disrupted. And again, they're hearing like what the press is telling them, what the government is telling them about communism. We don't know. Like, I don't know how the picture was painted. Of course there's going to be a bias about it, but yeah, like people are just scared. Like you just hear the word communism and you automatically are just horrified. So yeah, it's like the parallels to 1984 is insane. It's like it's horrifying. This is real life. This actually happened in the US. This isn't a fictional novel. And
Yeah, and not that far like away ago. This isn't. It's less than 100 years.
yeah, this is in the 1950s. Like it's really not that long ago. And yeah, okay, so this kind of brings me to my next point. This I had never heard of this, but McCarthy apparently he didn't just attack communists in the government. He also attacked the LGBTQ plus community in what would later be known as the Lavender Scare. I really had never heard about this, but basically McCarthy argued that LGBTQ plus employees could be blackmailed by enemy agents over their sexuality and could thereby betray national secrets. In 1950, Senate Republicans write up a report saying that gay and lesbian government workers were a potential moral threat to the government. And later in 1953, President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450, which allowed the government to track down gay and lesbian government employees and fire them due to the labeling of sexual perversion as an undesirable trait for employment. Which this is horrifying. So several employees either were fired or they resigned out of fear, and various surveillance measures were instituted to try and track down employees' intimate habits. Like this is a violation of privacy and civil rights, civil liberties on like every level.
Yeah, everything. It's like the things that we criticize with other countries that have communist regimes, and like we're literally doing the same exact thing in order to smash down communism.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh my gosh, it's just I can't believe we got away with this. But the most horrifying aspect of this is that this governmental ban on LGBTQ plus employees wasn't officially lifted until President Bill Clinton's administration in the 1990s. So this like executive order was in place for a very long time. I don't know if everyone acted upon it, but it's still like the government had the right to like to spy on you and see and like go into your intimate personal life. Like that's such a breach of privacy. It's so horrifying. And yeah, just like a friendly reminder to everyone, it wasn't until a month ago that the Supreme Court ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects LGBTQ plus employees from discrimination based on sex. So there's still so much work that needs to be done. And like it's kind of a theme in like every episode. We always say that, but
Yeah, I mean, history is like progressive through time, right? So
that's
yeah,
very
there's always work.
that's true. But yeah, like I guess the reason I point that out is because like when we talk about the Red Scare, it's easy to dismiss it as like, oh, it was so long ago, but like we still see the effects up until recent history.
You're right. Actually, there's a really good quote, and I forget who said it. I will look it up and like requote this later, but it was something like, with history, we often think that the future is closer than it is and that the past is further away. And that's so true. Like, we think that we're more further ahead with being accepting and open to people and world peace than we actually are. We don't see like the work that we have to do still, and we think that the terrible events in our past are a lot further back than they actually are.
I love that quote so much. That's so true though. Like really, if you think about it, that's so true. I need to
Yeah.
get that, like tattooed.
Write that on my tombstone. Like,
Really? Oh my gosh. But yeah, that's why it's important to talk about history because it's really not that long ago and it has obviously has lasting effects on our society today. So yeah, but I guess to continue, obviously the Red Scare has to come to an end. And so people were able to overlook Senator McCarthy's attacks on government employees and other elites in the US, but people immediately lost support for him once he decided to go after members of the armed services. So in April 1954, millions of Americans watched as Senator McCarthy attacked members of the Army and its legal TV on live television. And almost immediately, this sense of, I guess, like invulnerability that had surrounded him disappears. And there are pretty much two reasons for his downfall. So, first, the Army's legal counsel was able to undermine his credibility by showing evidence that Senator McCarthy had tried to win preferential treatment for his aides when they were drafted in the war. And that's like super, I think, yeah, that's illegal and not good at all. So they're like, okay, this dude's not good. And then,
Yeah. Wait, can we talk about what that means? Like
yeah,
in more layman's terms?
when his aides and his colleagues, like his like staff, they were drafted into the war. I guess this is World War II. This is like showing evidence in the past. When they were drafted into the war, he was like, "Oh, I want them to be in like easy positions, or I want them to be like stationed in the U.S. somewhere." But he basically asked the army to be like, "Hey, like I don't want them to get hurt. Can you put them somewhere nice and cushy?" And like while
Oh, okay.
Americans who are being drafted like get stationed all over the world. But yeah, so secondly, the American people were able to see for the first time on live television how Senator McCarthy intimidated witnesses and gave evasive responses when questioned. Because people, I mean, they didn't really have televised court like that. This was the first time the American people were actually seeing him in work and like, you know, doing his thing. And they were like, this is awful. Like, this guy's horrible. And so I guess uh, one of the things people remember the most about Senator McCarthy is when he started to attack a young Army lawyer, and the Army's chief counsel, Joseph Welch famously shouted, "Have you no decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" Which I guess in like 1950s, like terminology, like this is the biggest uh like insult ever, just like, oh, you have no sense of decency left. And yeah, like this soundbite is really popular. It's in the song Caught Their Eyes by Jay-Z. Like literally when I was watching a video about Senator McCarthy and then he like says that line and I was like, oh my gosh, that's a guy from the Jay-Z song. It's so bad, it's so bad, but
That's okay. You should link it in the show notes or in our description.
everyone should check it out. It's a great song.
Or
But
the original soundbite. You could link both. Like I was thinking the original soundbite, but the song too, that's fine.
oh boy, yeah, we can link both. While you're at it, you guys have time, you can listen to both. But
Stream Jay-Z.
yeah, stream Jay-Z now. But yeah, so that's like a really famous quote. And so after this, the Senate, like, they also lose support for McCarthy. They're like, finally, we can go after him. We hate him. They vote to condemn Senator McCarthy for his, quote, inexcusable, reprehensible, vulgar, and insulting conduct that was unbecoming of a senator, unquote. And his 5-year long reign of terror finally came crashing down. And Senator McCarthy would keep his position as senator, but he pretty much lost all of his power. And he actually died in 1957 at the age of 48 due to acute hepatitis and liver failure as a result of complications from alcoholism. So he like pretty much dies right after he leaves office. And that's the fall of McCarthyism. And basically the Red Scare, kind of after his reign of terror ends, people become like, you know, it's not, red baiting is has less power. It's not as common anymore. People are like, okay, actually this was horrible and maybe we should reconsider what we're doing. And so the Red Scare kind of quiets down, and communism is still, obviously the Cold War lasts forever, but I guess in government and attacking other federal employees and even like Hollywood actors were also attacked too. Like, it was crazy. So yeah, the tactic of red baiting quiets down, but we still are very much in the Cold War. So Soviet Union is still very much our enemy. And while a small number of the accused communists may have been guilty of conspiring to revolt against the government, the vast majority of victims of the Red Scare were falsely accused or had done nothing more than exercise their constitutional right to join a political party. And the thousands of alleged communist sympathizers had their lives and their reputations completely destroyed. They were attacked by law enforcement, revoked of basic civil liberties, they're alienated from their families and their friends, and they're fired from their jobs. So this ruined so many people's entire lives. And again, the word communism was turned into a term that Americans would immediately react to with disgust or fear, regardless of whether or not they actually understood what it means. And you can still see similar reactions today with both the terms communism and socialism, even though, at least me personally, I really didn't understand the ideology until more recently. And of course, I'm not trying to push like any political views on listeners, but I do think it really is important, like, to educate yourself and take the time to understand these concepts, whether you agree with them or not. And the same thing goes for capitalism. Like, you should educate yourself on what this really means and understand it well, because like, if we don't understand something, it's super easy to be swept up in a mass hysteria and be overcome by fear. But knowledge is power, and it can help keep us rational. So I think that's really one of the main lessons that we can learn from the Red Scare. And that's how we make sure we don't repeat this really shameful part of history in the future. And yeah, that's pretty much a summary of the Red Scare.
Yay! I love it. No, very nicely said. Very nicely wrapped up in a bow at the
Thanks for
end.
listening, everyone. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully you guys learned something new. We'll see you again next time.
Yay!